The name patch was the first thing Surveyor Ilavith noticed. Not the shelter, though the shelter was remarkable in its own right. A low structure of stacked basalt slabs, chinked with dried clay and roofed with overlapping sheets of hull composite that still bore faded serial numbers from whatever vessel had brought the human here. Not the irrigation channels, either, though they showed a precision that made Ilavith pause and re-examine his initial classification of the site as temporary habitation. Not even the fire pit, which was cold but clean, the ash recently swept, the stones arranged in a pattern that served thermal distribution rather than aesthetics. The name patch, stitched to the left breast of a flight suit hanging from a line of braided cable between two rock pillars at the entrance to the shelter. The suit itself was wrecked, the fabric faded from black to the color of slate, the seams restitched in at least 4 different materials including what appeared to be dried sinew, the right sleeve torn off at the shoulder and replaced with a wrap of layered hull insulation. But the name patch was intact, hand-stitched. Not the original machine-embroidered version, which had presumably disintegrated with the rest of the suit's detailing years ago, but a careful replacement, done by hand with a bone needle and thread pulled from the suit's own interior lining. Block letters, painstaking, slightly uneven in the way that hand-sewn work always was. Each letter approximately 8 millimeters tall, 5 letters. Gross. Ilavith leaned closer. The stitching was tight and deliberate. The thread had been dyed or stained, more likely a dark reddish-brown that stood out against the faded gray fabric. The edges of the patch had been folded under and hemmed with a secondary stitch that Ilavith recognized from the textile chapter of his Xenocultural Reference Index as a technique called a blind hem, used in Terran garment construction to create a clean, finished edge. Someone had spent hours on this. Someone had taken the time, in an environment where time was synonymous with survival, to sit down with a bone needle and thread, and stitch their own name back onto their chest. Ilavith straightened and entered the notation into his survey tablet. He was thorough. That was why the Directorate had assigned him to the Vaineth Margin Survey, not because the Vaineth Margin was expected to contain anything of interest, but because Ilavith was the kind of surveyor who would catalog the interesting absence of interest with the same rigor he would apply to a civilization. 14 habitable worlds in the survey block, all pre-assessed as uninhabited, all requiring ground truth verification before the Directorate could authorize mineral extraction permits. Routine work. The kind of assignment that went to surveyors who were competent enough to trust, but not ambitious enough to waste on frontier reconnaissance. Ilavith did not resent the assignment. He was Kethurin, and the Kethurin did not resent assignments. They completed them. Resentment was an energy expenditure with no measurable return. This shelter, this irrigation system, this fire pit, this name patch, none of it had been predicted. Vaineth 7 was listed in the Directorate Registry as a Category 3 uninhabited world, atmosphere breathable, gravity within tolerance, indigenous biosphere limited to vegetation and invertebrate fauna. No sentient presence detected by orbital survey, confirmed by 2 separate flyover scans at different orbital phases. The extraction permit application was already filed. Ilavith's ground truth survey was the final checkbox. The checkbox now had a complication. He walked the perimeter of the shelter, documenting. The structure was approximately 4 meters by 3, oriented with the open face toward the southeast, which on Vaineth 7 meant it caught the morning sun, and was shielded from the prevailing afternoon wind that came down off the basalt ridgeline to the northwest. The walls were load-bearing, the stones selected for flatness and interlocked without mortar in a pattern that Ilavith's reference index identified as dry stone walling, another Terran technique, dating back several thousand years in their architectural history. The roof sheets were secured with braided cable anchored to stone cairns at each corner. The floor was packed earth, swept clean, with a sleeping platform of layered vegetation along the back wall and a work surface of flat stone along the left. On the work surface, tools, a hand axe made from a basalt cobble lashed to a composite handle with sinew, a knife fashioned from a shard of hull plating, the edge ground smooth, a bone needle, a coil of thread, a small bowl carved from wood containing what appeared to be rendered fat mixed with plant fiber, a crude but functional adhesive or sealant, and a piece of hull plating, roughly 30 centimeters square, propped against the back wall behind the sleeping platform. Scratched into its surface with the tip of the hull shard knife, in the same careful block letters as the name patch, were 2 lines of text. The first line, Cross MSGT, Terran Survey Corps. The second line, a number. Ilavith counted the digits, 4, a year perhaps or an identifier, he recorded it. 2917. He stared at the number. Cross had been counting. Days, almost certainly. Ilavith ran the conversion in his head against the Terran standard calendar his reference index maintained. 2917 Terran standard days was approximately 8 Terran years. The surveyor stood in the empty shelter and looked at the name patch on the hanging flight suit and the number scratched into hull plating, and felt something he did not have a Kethurin word for. The closest approximation in his language was the term for an unexpected variable that altered the outcome of a calculation in a direction the calculator had not prepared for. It was not an emotion. The Kethurin did not have emotions in the Terran sense. They had response states, calibrated and predictable, indexed to stimulus categories. This particular response state was indexed to the discovery of evidence that contradicted a filed assessment, and its standard output was a notation in the survey log and a request for reclassification. But the response state had a texture to it that the standard index did not account for. The texture of looking at careful hand-stitching on a name patch and understanding that someone had spent hours preserving 5 letters, their own identity, on a world where identity served no survival function whatsoever, where there was no one to read the name, no one to call it, no rank structure to require it. The name was not functional. It was something else. Something the Kethurin index did not have a classification for. Ilavith left the shelter and followed the irrigation channels. They led downslope to a flat terrace of alluvial soil where the human had established a garden. The term was insufficient. It was an agricultural system. 8 raised beds, each approximately 2 meters long, separated by narrow paths of packed gravel, irrigated by a network of channels fed from a dammed spring approximately 40 meters uphill. The dam was a construction of stacked stone and clay, sealed with the same rendered fat compound Ilavith had found in the shelter. The channels were lined with flat stones set edge to edge, and the flow was regulated by small removable plugs of clay at each bed's intake point. The crops were a mix of indigenous and cultivated species. Ilavith recognized 3 of the indigenous plants from the Orbital Survey's vegetation index: a broadleaf tuber, a climbing legume analog, and a ground cover succulent that the database listed as marginally edible for carbon-based metabolisms. The cultivated species were unfamiliar. They had the look of plants that had been selectively bred over multiple growing seasons, uniform height, consistent leaf shape, evidence of deliberate pruning. The human had been farming. Not foraging, not scavenging, not surviving. Farming. Building a food system with the patience and foresight of someone who intended to be here for a long time. The mission briefing had not prepared Ilavith for this. The briefing had been standard directorate protocol. 14 worlds, 7 days, ground truth each site against the orbital assessment, verify uninhabited status, note any discrepancies, file the certification for extraction permits. Vainith 7 was day 4. Ilavith had landed his survey skiff on the northern plateau at dawn, run the standard sensor sweep from the landing site, detected nothing anomalous, and begun his grid walk. The shelter was 2 kilometers south-southwest, tucked into a fold of basalt ridgeline, where a seasonal spring emerged from a fracture in the rock face. He had not expected to find a human being living here, but that was not what unsettled him. What unsettled him was the tally. 2,917 days, 8 years, alone. And the name patch, carefully stitched, maintained. The Kethurin had a word for this too, or thought they did. Perseverance, defined as the sustained application of effort toward a goal despite adverse conditions. But perseverance implied a goal, a destination, an outcome the effort was aimed at. Looking at the garden and the shelter and the name patch, Ilavith was not certain that the human's effort was aimed at an outcome at all. It seemed aimed at itself, at the act of continuing. At the daily decision to irrigate the garden and sweep the fire pit, and stitch the name patch, and scratch one more mark into the tally, and keep being a person on a world where there was no practical reason to be one. He heard the footsteps before he saw the human. They came from the east, along the ridgeline trail, steady and unhurried. The gait of someone who knew the ground. Ilavith turned and watched the tree line where the trail emerged from a stand of tall, gray-barked vegetation that his index classified as a hardwood analog. The human stepped into the cleared ground at the edge of the garden and stopped. She was smaller than the Directorate's standard physiological profile for Terran military personnel, though the profile was based on limited and possibly outdated data. She carried a bundle of dried wood under her left arm and a woven basket in her right hand. She wore the flight suit, the one without the right sleeve, patched and repatched, the name patch stitched to the chest. Her hair was cut short, unevenly, with a tool that was not designed for hair. Her skin was weathered and dark from years of sun exposure. Her hands were calloused and scarred, the fingernails clipped short and uneven. She looked at Ilavith. Ilavith looked at her. Neither moved. The moment stretched. The wind came down off the ridgeline and moved through the hardwood stand with a sound like slow breathing, and the afternoon sun lay across the garden beds in long bars of golden light, and the irrigation channels murmured faintly with the sound of water moving over stone. The human set the wood bundle down, slowly. She placed the basket beside it. Then she straightened and her right hand moved to the name patch on her chest. She touched it, not adjusting it, not pointing at it, touching it. The way someone touches a thing to confirm it is real. "I'm cross," she said. Her voice was rough, the consonants slightly flattened in the way that voices degrade when they go unused for long stretches. "Master Sergeant, Terran Survey Corps, Service number 274091. She paused, licked her lips. "Are you real?" Ilavith processed the question. It was not a philosophical inquiry. It was a practical one. A human who had been alone for 2,917 days had reason to question whether a perceived visitor was an actual entity or a product of cognitive degradation. "I am Surveyor First Class Ilavith, Kethurin Directorate Ground Assessment Division," he said. "I am conducting a ground truth verification of Vaineth 7 uninhabited classification. You are a complication." The human made a sound. A short exhalation through the nose, the mouth curved slightly upward at the corners. Ilavith's index classified it as laughter, subdued variant. "A complication," she said. 8 years and that's what I am." In the administrative context, yes. She looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes were steady, not the eyes of a person in crisis, or a person who had been broken by isolation, or a person performing distress for the benefit of a rescuer. The eyes of a person who had been doing a job alone for a very long time and was now discovering that someone else existed. "Are there others with you?" she asked. "I am alone. My survey skiff is on the northern plateau. I have communication capability with the Directorate Relay Network." She nodded slowly. Then she picked up the wood bundle and the basket and walked past him toward the shelter. She moved with an economy that Ilavith recognized the movement pattern of someone who had learned to spend exactly as much energy as a task required and no more. No wasted steps, no hesitation, no urgency. "I'll make a fire," she said. "You'll want to talk." He did want to talk. Or rather, his survey protocol required him to conduct an interview, which was a form of talking that the Kethurin were more comfortable with because it had structure and purpose, and a form to fill out at the end. The fire pit came to life with practiced efficiency. Cross arranged the wood in a structure that Ilavith's index called a log cabin lay parallel pairs stacked at alternating 90-degree angles, creating a chimney effect that drew air through the center. She struck sparks from a piece of hull plating against a chunk of quartz, caught them in a nest of dried fiber, and blew the ember into flame with 3 measured breaths. The fire was burning cleanly within 4 minutes. Ilavith noted the time. It was efficient. She sat on a flat stone beside the fire pit. Ilavith remained standing, his survey tablet in hand. The sun was beginning its descent toward the ridgeline, and the light in the shelter's open face had gone from bright gold to deep amber. The name patch on her chest caught the firelight, and the careful stitching through tiny shadows between the letters. "Your vessel," Ilavith said. "Where is it?" "2 ridges east. What's left of it? Lost a nacelle on descent, clipped the ridgeline, went in hard. Fuselage broke in 3 sections. I salvaged what I could carry in the first week, then stripped the rest over the next month. Anything useful is here or in the outbuilding." She gestured to a smaller stone structure behind the main shelter that Ilavith had not yet inspected. "Communication equipment. Destroyed on impact. I built a signal beacon from the nav computer's oscillator and a jury-rigged antenna, ran it for 19 months before the power cell gave out." She said this without inflection. "A fact, reported. Nobody came. Vaineth 7 is not on a standard communication relay path. Your beacon's signal strength, if constructed from a nav oscillator, would have been insufficient to reach the nearest relay node at any point in the planet's orbital cycle. I know that now. Didn't know it then. I knew the oscillator's rated output, and I knew the relay frequencies. What I didn't know was that the Directorate had reclassified the Vaineth margin as a low-priority sector and moved the nearest relay node 8 light months further out during the year I was in transit. My signal was shouting into a room that nobody was in." Ilavith recorded this. The reclassification she referenced was accurate Vaineth margin sector relay reconfiguration, standard year 4207, a cost-efficiency measure that had reduced relay coverage in 12 low-traffic sectors. The measure had been reviewed and approved by the Directorate's Administrative Efficiency Council. The efficiency gain had been 0.3% of total relay operating costs. The cost had been, apparently, that a stranded human's distress signal went unheard for 19 months. "Your survey vessel," Ilavith said, "what was its mission?" "Solo geological survey. Standard contract work for Terran Survey Corps. Vaineth 7 was on my list as a secondary target atmosphere and soil sampling, nothing fancy. I was supposed to be here for 72 hours. The corner of her mouth moved again. "The schedule changed." "What caused the crash?" "Debris, uncharted, dense enough to shred a nacelle, fast enough that I had 3 seconds from detection to impact. The debris shouldn't have been there. I've spent 8 years thinking about that, and I still don't have an answer. Something came through the system, left a debris trail, and left. I was in the wrong place at the wrong time." Ilavith made a notation. The orbital debris anomaly would require its own investigation. For now, the immediate question was the human status and disposition. "You have been here for 2,917 days, he said. 2,918, she said. "I scratched today's mark this morning." "You maintained a daily count." "Every day, first thing after sunrise. Before water, before food, before anything else." "For what purpose?" She looked at him. The firelight moved across her face, and he could see the lines that 8 years of sun and wind had etched into her skin, deep lines around the eyes, a permanent squint pattern, the kind of weathering that Ilavith's index associated with sustained outdoor exposure without protective equipment. Her eyes were brown and clear, and they held his gaze with the steady attention of someone who was not accustomed to other faces and was therefore paying very close attention to this one. Because it's who I am, she said. Ilavith waited for elaboration. It did not come. The statement, in Kethurin conversational convention, was incomplete, a premise without a supporting argument. But the human seemed to consider it self-sufficient. She had stated a fact, and the fact was the argument. Because it's who I am. Ilavith considered this. In Kethurin experience, identity was a function of role. A surveyor was a surveyor because the directorate assigned the role, and the role conferred the identity, and the identity was maintained by the continued performance of the role's duties within the administrative structure. Remove the structure, remove the directorate, the assignment, the chain of reporting, and the identity would dissolve, because it had nothing to attach to. A Kethurin surveyor stranded alone on an uninhabited world would continue to perform survey functions for as long as the functions had measurable purpose, and when the purpose expired, when all measurable data had been collected, and there was no authority to receive it, the role would expire with it, and the Kethurin would enter a low-activity state that the medical literature called purpose cessation withdrawal. It was not uncommon. It was treated, when possible, with reassignment. The human had not entered purpose cessation withdrawal. She had stitched her name onto her chest and counted her days and built a garden and maintained a shelter and continued to be cross. M. SGT, Terran Survey Corps, for 2,918 days without an assignment, without a chain of reporting, without any administrative structure whatsoever. Not because a structure required it, because she required it of herself. Ilavith sat down. It was not a surveyor's posture. Surveyor stood, walked, documented. But something in the data he was collecting required a different posture. Your name patch, he said. The original was damaged. You recreated it by hand. Twice. The first hand-stitched version lasted about 3 years before the thread rotted. This one I made with thread pulled from the suit's thermal lining, longer chain polymer, slower degradation. Should last another 5 years at least. The effort required to produce it is significant. Several hours of hand stitching with a bone needle. The letters are uniform and carefully formed. About 6 hours, yes. This effort could have been applied to survival tasks, food production, shelter maintenance, tool manufacturing. Yes. But you chose to spend it on the name patch. Cross looked at the fire for a moment. A piece of wood shifted in the log cabin structure, sending up a brief column of sparks that drifted upward and died against the darkening sky. The first stars were appearing above the ridgeline, small hard points of light in a sky that was transitioning from pale violet to deep indigo. On my first day here, she said, after the crash, after I'd stopped the bleeding and taken stock of what I had and what I didn't have, I sat in the wreckage and I looked at my flight suit. The name patch was still intact, the original machine-stitched Terran Survey Corps standard issue. My name, my rank, my unit. And I thought, I can take this off. Nobody's going to check. Nobody's going to care. I'm alone on a planet that nobody knows I'm on. And whether I wear a name patch or not makes exactly 0 difference to whether I live or die. She paused. The fire crackled softly. And then I thought, that's exactly why I have to keep it. Because there's nobody here to tell me who I am, so I have to tell myself, every day, first thing, before anything else, the name on my chest. The count on the wall, I am cross. This is day 1, day 2, day 100, day 1000, day 2918, cross, every morning, every day. She touched the patch again. The same gesture Ilavith had seen when she first emerged from the tree line. A confirmation, a ritual. The Kethurin would find that inefficient, Ilavith said. The Kethurin didn't crash on this rock. No, we did not. The fire settled. Cross added another piece of wood, adjusting its placement with the precision of someone who understood the geometry of combustion. Then she stood. Come, I'll show you the rest. She led him behind the main shelter, to the outbuilding he had noted earlier. It was smaller than the main structure, 2 meters by 2, roofed with the same hull composite, but sealed more carefully, the gaps between the stones packed tight and finished with a smooth layer of the rendered fat compound. Cross lifted a flat slab of stone that served as a door and leaned it against the wall. Inside, arranged with the organizational discipline of a military supply depot, was the wreckage of a life. Salvaged components filled 3 shelved tiers built from stacked stone and flat hull plating. Ilavath's index identified them as they came into view. A navigation computer's main circuit board stripped of its housing, the contact pins cleaned and bright. A bank of power cells, their charge indicators dark, lined up in a row of 12. Sections of conduit tubing, cut to precise lengths and labeled with scratched markings on strips of hull plating tied to each piece. Coils of wire, sorted by gauge. A collection of optical lenses from what had been the survey vessel's sensor array, each one wrapped in dried leaf fiber and nested in carved wooden holders. Cross pointed to the first shelf. Navigation and communication components, everything I stripped from the comm array and the nav computer. The signal beacon I built lasted 19 months before the main power cell died. I tried to jury-rig a replacement from the thruster gimbal's coupling, but the voltage regulation was wrong and it burned out the oscillator. I could have rebuilt the oscillator, I had the parts, but by then I'd used the antenna wire for the irrigation system support cables. She said this without bitterness. A decision made, a resource allocated, a consequence accepted. You chose irrigation over communication, Ilavath said. I chose food over a signal nobody was hearing. She moved to the second shelf. Half-completed tools in various stages of construction, and one finished device that Ilavath could not identify until Cross picked it up and demonstrated. A hand-cranked centrifuge for separating plant oils, built from the gyroscope housing of the vessel's attitude control system. The gyroscope spun smoothly on its original spacecraft-grade bearings, cleaned and relubricated with plant-derived oil. Took me 4 months, she said. Best set of sealed bearings on the planet. Seemed wasteful to let them sit in wreckage. The third shelf held something different. Not tools, not components. Records. The hull plating sheets he had glimpsed in the shelter were duplicated here, a second set, stored in the sealed outbuilding away from weather exposure. Backup copies. Cross had carved the same data into 2 sets of metal sheets and stored them in 2 separate locations. Redundant records, Ilavath observed. Standard practice. 1 copy at the primary worksite, 1 copy in protected storage. In case of fire, structural collapse, or the ghost of that subdued exhalation again, unexpected visitors who might need to take a set with them. She had planned for this. Not rescue specifically, she had said herself that she had no rational expectation of rescue. But she had planned for the possibility that her data would need to survive her, and she had taken the precaution of storing it in a format and location that maximized its chances. Hull plating did not rot, did not burn easily, did not degrade in sunlight. The scratched text was shallow enough to be legible but deep enough to resist weathering. Centuries from now, if the Directorate or anyone else came to this world, the records would still be readable. Cross led him back outside and down the slope to the garden, where the afternoon light lay warm and golden across the terraces. She walked the rows with the authority of a person giving an inspection tour, which, Ilavath realized, was exactly what she was doing. For the first time in 8 years, someone was looking at her work. The precision of her movements sharpened. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the cadence of a formal briefing. Row 1 through 4 staple crops. The tuber, I call it a groundnut, though it's not related to anything Terran, produces a starchy root with roughly 1,800 kilocalories per kilogram. Wild version produced about 900. I doubled the yield density over 5 growing seasons by selecting for root mass and replanting only from the largest specimens. She knelt beside one of the plants and brushed the soil away from its base, revealing a thick, pale root the size of her fist. This is a 7th-generation cultivar. The wild ancestor's root was the size of my thumb. 7 generations, 7 years, and it's the difference between subsistence and surplus. She replaced the soil carefully, pressing it back into place with her palm. I have surplus now, more food than I can eat. I dry the extra and store it in the outbuilding. She moved to the next row. Climbing legume analog. Nitrogen fixer, it enriches the soil for the other crops. I rotate it through different beds on a 3-season cycle. Took me 2 years to figure out the rotation pattern. The first year I planted everything together and the soil went acidic and half the crop failed. What did you do? Ate less, foraged from the wild stands to fill the gap, redesigned the rotation, never happened again. Row by row, she walked him through the system. The succulent ground cover grown as a living mulch. The grain like grass, the one she had bred through 7 generations from a wild species, with tiny, bitter seeds, now producing heads of plump, pale seeds that she ground into a flour using a stone quern carved from the local basalt. The herb analog that she grew along the irrigation channels for its antimicrobial properties. You are a botanist as well as a surveyor, Ilevith said. I'm a geologist. My survey specialization was mineral analysis. I knew nothing about plants when I crashed here. She stood up, brushing soil from her knees. I learned. 8 years of teaching herself botany, agriculture, plant breeding, soil science, hydrology alone, without references, without mentors. The directorate had multi-year academies for this. Cross had done it with a knife and a piece of hull plating. Ilevith felt the unnamed response state again, stronger this time. Show me the water system, he said. It was not a standard survey request. It was something else, something closer to what humans might call curiosity, though the Kethurin word for curiosity was a mild, academic term that did not capture the intensity of what Ilevith was feeling. He wanted to understand, not just document, understand. Cross led him uphill to the spring. The source was a fracture in the basalt ridge face, roughly 2 meters above the valley floor, where groundwater seeped through porous volcanic rock and emerged as a steady trickle. She had built the dam directly across the fracture, a curved wall of stacked stone, sealed with clay and the rendered fat compound, creating a basin approximately 1 meter deep and 3 meters across. The water was clear, with a faint mineral shimmer on the surface. Flow rate varies by season, she said. Peak is during the warm season, roughly equivalent to your standard spring, when snowmelt from the upper ridges percolates through the rock. Low season is midwinter, when the ground freezes to a depth of about 40 centimeters and the flow drops to a trickle. I built a secondary storage basin. She pointed to a depression in the rock downstream, lined with hull plating and sealed at the joints, to buffer the low-season deficit. Holds about 1,200 liters. Enough to maintain the garden through a 6-week dry spell. You anticipated the seasonal variation before experiencing it. No, I experienced the seasonal variation. The first winter, the flow stopped entirely for 11 days. I almost lost the garden. The second winter, I was ready. She showed him the distribution system, the main channel from the dam, branching into secondary channels at each terrace level, each branch controlled by a removable clay plug. The engineering was simple but effective, gravity-fed, requiring no moving parts or power. The channels were lined with flat stones set in clay, the joints sealed, the gradient carefully calibrated so the water moved at a consistent rate without pooling or overflowing. I surveyed the gradient with a plumb line and a straight edge made from a piece of hull stringer, she said. Took 6 attempts to get the slope right. The first 3 were too steep, water scoured the channel lining out. The fourth was too shallow, water pooled and bred invertebrates that damaged the plant roots. 5th was close. 6th was right. 6 attempts. 6 times digging a channel by hand with stone tools, lining it, testing it, finding it wrong, filling it back in, and starting over. The kind of work that the directorate would assign to a team of 4 with powered excavation equipment and a surveying drone. Cross had done it alone with a hand axe and a plumb line. The sun was dropping toward the ridgeline now, and the shadows of the hardwood stand were lengthening across the upper terraces. Ilavith had been on the ground for 7 hours. His survey protocol called for a 4-hour site visit per world. He had already exceeded his time budget by 75%, and he had not yet completed a single field on the standard assessment form. He did not care. This was not a standard assessment. They returned to the shelter as the light turned amber. Cross rebuilt the fire. Ilavith sat on the flat stone opposite her and opened a new line of questioning. "The first year," he said, "describe it." Cross fed a piece of wood into the fire. "The first 30 days were about not dying. I had injuries from the crash, 3 broken ribs, a dislocated shoulder, lacerations on both arms. I set the shoulder myself, bound the ribs with strips of hull insulation, cleaned the cuts with groundwater and hoped it wasn't infectious. It wasn't. Lucky. And after the first 30 days, I started building. Shelter first. The wreckage gave me raw material but no habitable structure. It was warm season when I crashed, but I could see the ridgeline getting snow on the upper slopes, and I knew winter was coming. Built the shelter in 16 days, working from dawn to dark. Then the fire pit. Then the signal beacon. Then I started foraging and learning which plants were edible." "How did you determine edibility?" "Small quantities, 1 plant at a time. Eat a small piece, wait 12 hours, monitor for symptoms. If nothing happened, eat a larger piece the next day. Wait again. Build up gradually." She paused. "I poisoned myself twice. A purple root vegetable looked harmless, tasted mild, sent me into convulsions 6 hours later, vomited for 2 days. I marked that one in my records with 3 X's. Do not eat." "And the name Patch, when did the ritual begin?" Cross was quiet for a moment. The fire moved. The light shifted on her face. "Day 43. I was sitting in the shelter in the dark. It was winter by then. The first winter, the bad one, before I understood the seasonal cycles or had stored enough food. I was hungry, cold, alone, and I hadn't spoken out loud in 6 weeks. And I looked down at my flight suit, and the original name Patch was starting to come loose. The machine stitching was degrading, the polymer thread wasn't rated for continuous UV exposure, and it was breaking down." She stopped, reached for the patch, touched it. "I sat there looking at it, and I had this thought: if it falls off, nobody will know who I am, not even me. I'll just be a body on a rock, a thing that used to be a person. And the thought scared me more than the cold or the hunger or any of it, more than the idea of dying, the idea of becoming nobody." Her fingers traced the letters, CROSS. "So I pulled thread from the suit lining, carved a bone needle from an invertebrate shell I'd found in the creek bed, and I stitched it. Took me most of the night because my hands were shaking from the cold and I kept losing the needle in the dark. But by morning it was done. My name, on my chest, and I said it out loud: I am Cross. And then I scratched the first mark on the wall, day 43, and I have not missed a day since." Silence settled between them, broken only by the fire and the wind off the ridge. Ilavith looked at his survey tablet. The screen showed the half-completed ground truth assessment form. Fields for atmospheric composition, soil analysis, vegetation index, geological survey, indigenous fauna assessment. And now, inconveniently, a field that the form did not contain: evidence of sapient habitation. The extraction permit could not be filed. The uninhabited classification would need to be revised. The directorate would request a review, and the review would generate a report, and the report would require documentation, and the documentation would take months. Standard administrative process. Ilavith understood the process. He had spent his career within it. "I will need to report your presence," he said. "I assumed. The directorate will send a recovery vessel. The process will take time. The Vaineth margin is remote, and resource allocation for recovery operations in low-priority sectors follows a queue system. Estimated arrival of a recovery vessel is 4 to 7 standard months. 4 to 7 months. Yes. Cross considered this. She did not look distressed. She did not look relieved. She looked like a person running a calculation, assessing the new information against her existing operational framework and adjusting her plans accordingly. "My garden will need to be maintained while I'm gone," she said. Ilavith felt the lateral contraction of his nictitating membrane, the Kethurin processing pause, triggered when incoming data did not match any predicted response pattern, and the cognitive system needed an additional cycle. "You have been isolated on this world for nearly 8 Terran years. You are being offered recovery and return to your species. Your response is concern for your garden." "My response is that I've spent 8 years building something here. The water system works. The soil is productive. The shelter is sound. 47 varieties of edible plants cataloged, 12 successfully cultivated, 3 selectively bred for improved yield. I know this ground. I know the weather patterns, the soil chemistry, the seasonal cycles, the water table depth at 14 different points across this valley. I have data." She stopped, looked at him. "I'm a surveyor, Ilavith, same as you. I just didn't have anyone to file the report with." Ilavith looked at the garden, the irrigation system, the shelter, the tools. 8 years of data collection without a filing authority. 8 years of survey work without a mandate. 8 years of being a surveyor because that was what she was, not because anyone had assigned her to be. He picked up his tablet. He opened a new entry in the survey log, outside the standard ground truth form, in the open notation field that was reserved for observations that did not fit the pre-formatted categories. "Dictate your findings," he said. Cross stared at him. For the first time since he had met her, something shifted behind her eyes. Not tears. Cross was not the kind of person who cried in front of a stranger, and Ilavith suspected she was not the kind who cried at all, or if she did it alone at night, after the fire was banked and the tally was scratched and the name patch was stitched and the day was done. But something moved. A response state that Ilavith's index had no classification for. "You want my survey data," she said. "You have conducted an 8-year continuous ground survey of a world that the Directorate's orbital assessment categorized as unremarkable. Your data, if accurate, represents the most comprehensive single-observer planetary study in the Vaineth Margin survey block. It would be wasteful not to collect it." "Wasteful? The Kethurin do not waste data." Cross was quiet for a moment. Then she reached over to the work surface, picked up the carved wooden bowl, the one containing the rendered fat sealant, and set it aside. Beneath it was a stack of hull plating sheets, each one roughly the size of her hand, each one covered on both sides with dense, small handwriting scratched into the metal with the tip of her knife. "Soil pH and mineral content at 16 test sites, seasonal variation over 7 years," she said, laying out the first sheet. "Precipitation patterns and groundwater table measurements," the second sheet. "Indigenous plant species index 231 identified with growth cycle data, edibility assessments, and nutritional analysis where I could approximate it." She laid out 3 more sheets. "Geological observations, atmospheric variation by season. Invertebrate fauna catalog, 2 more. And cultivation notes, breeding records, yield data, 8 years of it." She laid the last sheet on the stone and looked at Ilavith. "Nobody asked me to keep records," she said. "Nobody told me to. Nobody was ever going to read them. I kept them because that's what a surveyor does." Ilavith looked at the stack of scratched metal sheets. 8 years of meticulous observation, recorded in the most primitive medium available, by a person who had no rational expectation that the records would ever be collected. Wasteful effort by Kethurin standards, purposeless. The data had no filing destination, no administrative chain, no contribution to any directorate objective. And yet the data existed. It was precise. It was comprehensive. It was the work of someone who had refused to stop being what they were, even when the context that defined them had been stripped away entirely. He began to transcribe. Cross dictated, and the data flowed in a steady, organized stream: pH values and mineral concentrations and rainfall totals and species counts, delivered with the calm authority of a person reporting to a superior officer. Her voice steadied as she spoke. The roughness smoothed. The consonants sharpened. She was not talking to Ilevith. She was filing the report she had been writing for 8 years. And the act of filing it, of finally having someone to receive the data, was restoring something that the isolation had not destroyed but had held suspended, like a seed in dry soil, waiting for water. The first data set was soil chemistry. Cross organized it by test site, working through the 16 locations she had established across the valley and the surrounding ridgeline slopes. Each site had its own characteristics. The alluvial terrace was rich in nitrogen and phosphorus from organic decay. The ridge slopes were mineral-heavy with high iron content. The spring-fed areas had elevated calcium from the dissolved limestone. She knew the numbers from memory. Not approximately. Exactly. pH 6.4 at Site 7 during warm season, dropping to 5.9 during the winter freeze cycle as decomposing vegetation released organic acids. Phosphorus at 12 parts per million at the garden terrace, rising to 18 after she began composting invertebrate remains in the second year. Nitrogen levels that she tracked with a crude colorimetric test she had devised using a naturally occurring indicator plant, a small weed whose leaves changed color in response to soil nitrogen, shifting from pale green at low concentrations to deep blue-green at high ones. "You developed a bioassay for soil nitrogen," Ilevith said, pausing his transcription. "I needed to know when to rotate the legume beds. The nitrogen-fixing species enriches the soil, but over-enrichment causes foliage growth at the expense of root and seed development. I needed a way to measure it. The color change plant was reliable, not precise by laboratory standards, but consistent enough to make decisions." She had invented a measuring instrument from a weed. The directorate's agricultural scientists used spectrophotometric analyzers for the same purpose. Cross had used a plant and her own eyes and 8 years of careful observation. The second data set was meteorological: precipitation, temperature, wind patterns, atmospheric pressure variations. She had no instruments for most of these: no barometer, no thermometer, no wind gauge. She had proxies. Temperature she estimated by the freezing behavior of standing water in stone basins she had placed at different elevations. Precipitation she measured by the water level in a standardized collection vessel, a hull-plating cylinder of known diameter that she read at the same time each morning. Wind speed she categorized qualitatively on a scale she had devised herself: calm, light, steady, strong, gale. She had 8 years of daily entries. "Your measurement methodology," Ilevith said, "would not meet directorate standards for instrumental precision." "No, but the data is internally consistent. Every measurement was taken with the same instrument, by the same observer, using the same methodology at the same time of day for 8 years. The absolute values may be off, but the trends are solid. I can tell you exactly when the first frost comes, within a 3-day window, based on the position of the constellation I call the Plough relative to the ridgeline." The constellation she called the Plough. Ilevith felt the unnamed response state stir again. She had named the stars. They worked through the night. The fire burned low, and Cross rebuilt it without interrupting her dictation. The stars wheeled overhead in unfamiliar constellations, unfamiliar to Ilevith, who knew a different sky, but clearly familiar to her, because she referenced them in her atmospheric data, pointing to specific stars and naming the compass bearings she had assigned them, and explaining how she used their positions to calibrate her seasonal measurements. She pointed to a cluster of 4 bright stars above the northern ridge. The anchor. It doesn't move or moves so little I can't detect it over 8 years. Everything rotates around it. I use it as my fixed reference point for all compass bearings. She pointed east to a reddish star low on the horizon, the Watcher. It tracks across the eastern sky from north to south over the course of a year, and when it reaches the notch in the ridgeline, that gap between the 2 tallest peaks, the warm season starts within 10 days. I've correlated it with 6 consecutive years of temperature data. The correlation is tight. She had built an entire astronomical calendar from scratch, named it, mapped it, used it to predict agricultural seasons. A navigation system created by one person standing on a rock and looking up for 3,000 nights. It was crude by directorate standards and flawless by the only standard that mattered. It kept her alive. The third data set was biological, the indigenous species catalog. 231 identified species of vegetation, categorized by growth habit, habitat, seasonal cycle, and utility. 49 species of invertebrate fauna, cataloged by morphology, habitat, and behavioral observations. Cross recited the entries from memory with the taxonomic precision of a trained biologist, which, Ilavith reminded himself, she was not. She was a geologist who had taught herself biology through 8 years of daily observation. Her naming system was her own descriptive shorthand. Each species got a 2-part name, the first describing the organism's primary visible characteristic and the second describing its habitat. Blue leaf creek bank, red stem ridge face, spiral shell clay flat. Species 47, she said, her voice beginning to show the strain of hours of continuous speech. Threadwing cloud layer, a flying invertebrate, wingspan approximately 4 centimeters, body mass negligible, appears exclusively during warm season thermals, rides the updrafts along the ridge face in groups of several hundred. Diet unknown, I've never observed feeding behavior, possibly atmospheric, filtering microparticles from the air column. They produce a sound. A vibration, really, from the wings. When several hundred of them are riding the same thermal, the sound is its accord. A sustained, harmonizing chord. It changes pitch as the thermal shifts. She stopped. The fire was low, just embers now, and the light in the shelter was dim and warm. I used to sit on the ridge and listen to them, she said, in the early years, when I was still adjusting. Ilavith waited. It was the only time I heard something that wasn't the wind or the water or my own voice. The thread wings, their chord. It wasn't music exactly, but it wasn't nothing either. It was a sound that something alive was making, and I was there to hear it, and for those few minutes I wasn't the only conscious thing on the planet. It mattered. She cleared her throat. Species 48, armorback burrow clay. She continued. The professionalism reasserted itself, the moment of softness folding back into the steady stream of data. But Ilavith had heard it, and he had recorded it not on the tablet, but in the space his cognitive architecture reserved for observations that did not fit any category. The thread wings and their chord, the human sitting on a ridgeline, alone, listening. Around midnight, Cross paused the dictation to make a circuit of the garden. Routine, she explained. She checked the irrigation channels at the same time every night, adjusting the clay plugs to account for overnight evaporation rates, clearing any debris that might block the flow. Ilavith followed her through the terraces in the starlight, watching her move along the channels with the confident precision of a person navigating territory they knew in the dark. She knelt at each intake point, tested the flow with her fingertips, made adjustments measured in millimeters. The whole circuit took 20 minutes. Every night, Ilavith asked. Every night, 6 p.m. check and midnight check, 2,918 nights times 2, 5,836 channel inspections. She stood, brushing soil from her knees. I stopped counting the inspections after year 3. The channels I still count. They returned to the fire. Cross rebuilt it for the 3rd time, adding wood from a covered stack beside the shelter. The stack was organized by species. She had learned which woods burned hot and fast, which burned slow and steady, which produced the most coals for overnight heat retention. She selected 3 pieces of a dense, dark wood from the bottom of the stack. Ironbark Ridgecrest, she said, placing them in the fire. Burns for 6 hours with minimal tending. I harvest it from the fallen timber on the north-facing slope. The living trees I don't touch. They stabilize the soil above the spring source, and if they come down, the erosion could silt up my dam. She had mapped the ecological connections. The trees above the spring fed the spring fed the dam fed the channels fed the garden. She understood her world as a system, and she managed it as one. The dictation resumed. The geological data was comprehensive: 8 years of observations on erosion patterns, mineral deposits, seasonal frost heave effects on the basalt ridge. Cross-described fault lines she had mapped by walking them, mineral deposits she had identified in creek gravels, iron oxides, manganese nodules, a copper-bearing ore on the eastern ridge slope. She had drawn a geological map on a large hull plating sheet in the outbuilding contour lines, drainage patterns, soil types, vegetation zones, mineral occurrences. The scale was approximate, the positions accurate. A geological map of an alien world, hand-drawn on scrap metal by a stranded geologist with no surveying instruments. The stars wheeled overhead. The constellation cross called the Anchor held its position above the northern ridge, and the Watcher tracked slowly eastward, and the thread wings were silent in the cold of the night, and the only sounds were the fire and the water and the human voice, hoarse now but steady, reporting. Ilavith listened and transcribed. He was learning something that the Directorate's training programs did not teach. He was learning what it sounded like when a human being poured 8 years of solitary effort into a receiving vessel for the first time. The relief was not in the voice. Cross's voice remained professional throughout. The relief was in the pace. She did not rush. She did not skip. She gave every data point its full measure, because every data point represented a day of work, and every day of work represented a choice to keep being Cross, and every choice to keep being Cross was the point. She had named the stars. The Kethurin would have given them registry numbers. She had named them the Anchor, the Watcher, the Plow, the 3 Sisters, the Drifter. Another purposeless act, another expenditure of cognitive energy on something that served no survival function. And yet, listening to her navigate her own sky with the confidence of a person in command of her territory, Ilavith understood something that his training had not prepared him for. The names were not purposeless. The name patch was not purposeless. The tally was not purposeless. The garden, the shelter, the painstaking records scratched into hull plating, none of it was purposeless. Purpose was not something the Kethurin assigned. It was something the human generated, from nothing. From the raw material of being alive on a rock with no one watching. She had built purpose the way she had built the shelter, stone by stone, day by day, with whatever was at hand. That was the thing about humans that the Directorate's xenological assessments consistently failed to capture. The assessments measured capability, physiology, technology, social organization. They did not measure this thing that Cross did. This refusal to become less than what she was. This insistence on maintaining identity and standards and record-keeping, and care for a garden on a world where none of it mattered. This stubborn, inefficient, categorically irrational commitment to being a person when there was no external reason to be one. Dawn came. The sky above the ridgeline turned from deep indigo to violet to a pale gold that spilled down the rock face and across the garden terraces, lighting the dew on the broad leaves of the tuber plants and the fine hairs on the stems of the climbing legumes. The irrigation channels caught the light and threw small bright lines across the soil. The fire had burned down to white ash. Cross's voice was hoarse. Hours of continuous dictation had taken a toll, but she had not stopped. "One more section," she said. "Cultivation notes. selective breeding records for the 3 modified cultivars. Ilavith looked at his tablet. 94 pages of transcribed data. The most detailed single-observer planetary survey in the Directorate's archive, produced by a person who was not Kethurin, not Directorate, not operating under any authority or mandate whatsoever. Produced because she was Cross, and Cross was a surveyor, and surveyors surveyed. "Continue," he said. She continued. The data came: planting dates, germination rates, growth measurements, cross-pollination methods, selection criteria, yield comparisons across growing seasons. Meticulous, organized. The work of a disciplined mind operating at full capacity alone for 8 years. She described the failures as precisely as the successes: the cross that produced bitter seeds in the 3rd generation, the drought-resistant line that lost its yield advantage when she moved it to richer soil, the tuber variant that grew large but split open during the first frost, rendering it unstorable. Each failure was a data point. Each data point was a step toward the cultivars that worked. The last entry was the grain grass. Terrace grain, she called it. 7 generations, beginning with a wild species whose seeds were the size of grains of sand and tasted like chalk dust. She had selected for seed size, then for taste, then for stalk strength, then for consistent ripening time. 7 years of cross-pollinating by hand with a fine bristle brush she had made from the fibers of a ridgecrest plant, tagging each parent plant with a colored thread, harvesting seeds individually, recording yields per plant to the nearest seed. Current generation produces approximately 4 grams of grain per head, she said. The wild ancestor produced 0.3 grams, 13-fold increase over 7 generations. She reached into the basket she had carried from the tree line, the one that had been sitting beside the woodpile since she first saw Ilavith. She opened it and held out a handful of seeds. Pale gold, the size of wheat grains, smooth and dry. "Taste one," she said. Ilavith looked at the seeds. His index contained no nutritional data for this species. It was technically an unclassified substance of unknown composition. He picked up one seed and placed it on his tongue. It was mild, slightly nutty with a faint sweetness, not remarkable by any culinary standard. But Cross was watching him with an expression he could not classify, and he understood that the taste of the seed was not the point. The point was that this seed had not existed 8 years ago. This seed was a thing she had made, from nothing, from a weed and a bone needle brush and 7 years of patient work in the sun on a world where nobody was watching. When she finished, the sun was well above the ridgeline, and the morning was warm and bright, and the garden lay in full daylight. The plants standing in neat rows, the channels flowing, the whole system humming with the quiet productivity of a thing built well and maintained with care. Cross sat on her stone and looked at the garden. Her hands rested on her knees, scarred, calloused, the nails blunt, the tendons visible beneath weathered skin. Working hands. Hands that had stitched a name patch and carved a tally and built a water system and bred new varieties of alien vegetation, because that was what was in front of her, and she was the kind of person who did what was in front of her. "I'm going to ask you something," she said, "and I need an honest answer. The Kethurin do not provide dishonest answers. It is inefficient. The extraction permits, for this world. Your survey was supposed to certify Vaineth 7 as uninhabited so the Directorate could start mining." Ilavith was quiet. This was not a field on his survey form. "Mining would destroy the garden," she said. "The water system, the cultivated varieties, 8 years of breeding data embodied in living plants. The extraction protocols do not account for individual-scale agricultural installations." "No, they don't. That's why I'm asking you, not the protocol." Ilavith looked at the garden. The 3 selectively bred cultivars, she had described them in her dictation. One was a modified tuber with twice the caloric density of the wild type, developed over 5 generations of selective cross-pollination. One was a legume analog that she had bred for drought tolerance by selecting from surviving plants during 2 consecutive dry seasons. One was a grain-like grass that she had developed from a wild species that produced seeds too small and bitter for consumption, breeding it through 7 generations, until the seeds were large enough to harvest and mild enough to eat. 8 years, 7 generations of a grain crop, 47 varieties catalogued, 12 cultivated, 3 created. On a world where nobody was watching. My survey report will note the presence of a significant xenobotanical research installation, Ilevith said. The Directorate's extraction protocols require environmental impact assessment for any site containing documented xenobotanical research of scientific value. The assessment process will delay extraction permits by a minimum of 18 standard months. Cross looked at him, the steady eyes, the weathered face, the name patch on her chest. "That's not a permanent protection," she said. "No, it is a delay. What happens after the delay depends on whether the data you have collected is reviewed by someone who recognizes its value." "And will it be?" Ilevith picked up the stack of scratched hull plating sheets, 94 pages of transcribed data on his tablet, and the physical records in his hands, 8 years of a human being's refusal to stop working. "I will file a recommendation for the data's inclusion in the Directorate's Xenobotanical Research Archive. If accepted, the research site will receive indefinite protected status under the Directorate's Scientific Heritage provision." "If accepted?" "Yes." Cross nodded. She did not ask for guarantees. She did not plead or argue or explain why the garden mattered. She accepted the conditional with the same calm she had accepted the crash, the isolation, the silence, the 2,918 days of counting without knowing whether anyone would ever hear the number. She reached down to the name patch on her chest, touched the stitching, ran her fingertip along the edge of the blind hem, tracing the letters, CROSS. "Will you be filing your ground truth assessment today?" she asked. "Yes." "I will need to return to my skiff to transmit the report." "Then you should take these." She gathered the hull plating sheets and held them out, "the originals for the archive." Ilevith took them. The metal was warm from the morning sun, and the scratched letters caught the light in thin silver lines against the gray surface. 8 years of data held in his hands. The weight was not significant. The weight of the content was something else entirely. "Master Sergeant Cross," he said, "for the record, my assessment." She waited. In the Kethurin Directorate's xenological classification system, sapient species are evaluated on 14 standard metrics. The metrics are designed to assess a species' capacity for organized behavior, environmental adaptation, and sustained productivity. The highest scoring species in the Directorate's registry achieve Category 1 status on between 8 and 11 metrics. He looked at the name patch, the bone needle stitching, the blind hem. The human species is not in the Directorate's registry. Humans are not classified. They are a known entity without a formal assessment, because every prior assessment team that attempted to evaluate them reported that the standard metrics were insufficient. Insufficient how? Ilevith held up one of the hull plating sheets, the one with the soil data, 7 years of pH measurements, recorded with a knife on scrap metal, by a person alone on a rock in an empty sector of space. The metrics measure what a species does when observed, resourced, and supported. They do not measure what a species does when none of those conditions apply. They have no category for a person who maintains a name patch by hand stitching for 8 years, because identity is a thing they refuse to surrender. They have no metric for a person who builds an agricultural research installation alone, without funding, mandate, or audience, because the work is worth doing regardless of whether anyone will ever know it was done. He placed the hull plating sheets carefully in his survey case. The metrics are insufficient because they assume that purpose is assigned. Humans demonstrate that purpose is generated. This is not a capacity the Kethurin classification system was designed to measure. It may be the most important thing the system fails to measure. Cross looked at him across the remains of the fire. The morning light was full and warm, and the name patch on her chest caught the sun, and the letters stood out in their careful hand-stitched lines, and the garden behind her was green and ordered and alive. 4 to 7 months, she said. For the recovery vessel, yes. I'll be here. She said it the way she had said everything else as a fact, reported. But Ilavith, who had spent his career collecting data and organizing it into categories, heard something beneath the fact. Not relief, not resignation. Something closer to what the tally on the wall represented, and the name patch and the garden and the records on the hull plating. Determination. The Kethurin had a word for it, but the word was a pale thing compared to what it described. Determination was a Kethurin choosing to complete a task because the task was assigned. What Cross had was something older and stranger and more durable. It was the decision, made fresh every morning for 2,918 mornings, to scratch one more mark on the wall and touch the name on her chest and walk out to the garden, and do the work that nobody had asked her to do, because the work was the point. Because being Cross was the point. Because the human capacity to generate purpose from nothing, from bare rock and empty sky, and the sound of wind on a ridgeline, was not a metric. It was the thing that made all the metrics irrelevant. Ilavith walked north toward the plateau and his waiting skiff. Behind him, the sound of water in the irrigation channels, and the quiet of a morning on a world that the Directorate had classified as unremarkable. The flight suit hung on its line between the two rock pillars. The wind moved it gently and the name patch turned in the light. 5 letters, hand-stitched, maintained, present. Gross. 2,918 days, and counting.